Welcome everyone to today's KLI Colloquium. I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Professor Tim Waring. Tim is an associate professor of applied cultural evolution at the University of Maine in the US.
Full professor now.
Oh, congratulations. You need to update your CV.
Give you the old CV.
Are there any more surprises? I hope the rest is correct. You need to correct me if not. So he got his PhD in human ecology at the University of California at Davis, and his bachelor's degree in biology at Haverford College in Pennsylvania. And before he started working as an assistant professor in Maine, he was an environmental science teacher in India for a couple of years, as I learned today. Tim works on the evolutionary theory of sustainability, and he applies it to case studies around the world. Recently, that includes projects on the evolution of cooperative organizations, on patterns and processes of long-term human evolution, and on cultural adaptation to climate change. And today, he will talk about the science of an evolutionary transition in humans. It's a pleasure having you here, Tim.
Thank you, Barbara. Can people hear me well enough? And does that thing go away? Let's see. Right. This thing will hide itself somehow, right?
Yeah, if you don't put that thing,
if I just
okay. Yes.
Good. Yes. Okay. Wonderful. And I want to make sure I have this correct. Yeah, it's down.
To the screen, and then you should be able to move it.
Okay. Yeah, right. Good. Okay. Thank you all. And thank you for hosting me here at the KLI. It is an absolute delight to be in this community and in this community again, to see some familiar faces and a bunch of new faces. And I've already had a bunch of excellent conversations that I'm looking forward to extending. I'll be here next week, particularly if you're interested in these pieces, as I'm currently working on assembling a project to try to advance the science in this particular area. And so I'd really look forward to conversations following on this. I haven't quite given a talk exactly like this before. I'm going to try to do a little bit of background, a little bit of summary of where the field is now. I will also be describing my own sort of take on where we can go with sort of this theory and the field of an evolutionary transition in humans. And then, depending on how much time I have left for myself at the end, I will talk a little bit about the importance of ethics in studying human evolution generally, and a little bit on a case study of application. So without further ado, it's kind of a long list, so I want to get to it. I think probably most of you here don't need me to explain why humans need special explanation. But I do think we do. We're really strange. From space, we look like a glowing slime mold, right? We don't think we look like a glowing slime mold, but we do, right? That's what we look like. That's us. And that's really weird because most mammals don't look like that, right? So this wonderful chaos of humanity, this is the type of curiosity that drove me to try to find the tools to start explaining who we are. And so, and of course, there are many different sort of weird components about us: our absolutely explosive population growth, our ecological invasion all over the planet in the last 50 or 100,000 years. We have our sort of explosive technological complexity. Again, these things are, there is sort of nothing like this. This is abiotic technological complexity. We have a surprising growth of social complexity as well, as our societies have become increasingly segmented and hierarchical as they've grown. And so these are some of the patterns that need explaining. And I will just briefly mention that to understand people, I feel you need theory that is able to address these. And so on some level, that theory needs to be something that is at least rooted in biology and the natural sciences. It needs to be able to have the ability to go into deep time, right? And have this long-term perspective, a global perspective as well. One of the pieces which underlies this, and is also something that biologists as well as social scientists have struggled with for a long time, is this question of society. Right? What is society? This is Thomas Hobbes' 1651 vision of what society is. A Leviathan, here depicted in his mind as a king that leads with both military power and religious power, and all of the people are sort of unified, giving up entirely their free will to the king. Outside of the idea that we no longer like kings, which is an important one, here's his quote. We create this great Leviathan called a commonwealth or a state, which is but an artificial man, right? Through the greater stature and strength than the natural, for whose protection and defense it was intended. And in which the sovereignty is an artificial soul, as giving life and motion to the whole body. So he really sort of sees this thing as an agent, right, as an individual. And of course, this is not something that is new to us, as creepy as it kind of is, right? But these patterns and theories and questions of autonomy keep coming up, not just in biology, but also in the social sciences. So what I want to give to you sort of generally is that, but for me personally, at least, a theory of humanity, right, or a theory of human evolution needs to be able to address these things. And even the evolutionary theories haven't quite done all of this yet to my liking, right? Sort of who are we, right? Our uniqueness, sort of the evolutionary trajectory. We need to account for these trajectories. What is society per se, right? Is it an individual in an evolutionary sense? Now, where are we going? And that's important because it may be useful for some thinking about some level of applicability. So now I'll take a brief excursion into some of the previous history of sort of evolutionary-based theories of understanding human uniqueness. Or in the early attempts at this, we had a lot of trait-based theories. Well, we make tools, right? We have language. We do war, we cook, right? So these are theories that actually work more to describe human uniqueness than actually to explain it, let alone explain what society is. Then, of course, starting in the 70s, we have sociobiology. And it's later on its descendant disciplines or fields, which work to try to extend this connection between social behavior and evolutionary processes, and do so in a number of different ways. Of course, mostly here I'm focused on humans in particular, because that's where sociobiology had its most controversy. But then finally, we come to what I like to call the sort of social synthesis of human evolution, which combines the evolution of cooperation with the evolution of adaptive culture. And those will be the themes that run through the rest of the talk. And I do want to say that it gives us this way to understand some of the trajectories we've seen here, right? Something about our uniqueness, something about this trajectory. But it doesn't quite solve this problem of what is society still. So yes, we're group structured, and yes, we have interesting, patterns and technology, but sort of why? And it does not give us sort of predictions in a way. So now we get to come to the beginning of the talk. What if we were to look at humans as undergoing an evolutionary transition? What if human evolution is itself a transitional process? To start here, I'll just give a brief sort of summary of the major transitions in evolution. From Maynard Smith and Zutmery in 95. Raise your hand if you're familiar with this, at least to some degree. Right, this is what I expected. I will be efficient. So they listed what were a bunch of important changes that had happened in the history of life, and sought to find ways in which they could be related and explained through a common framework. And they did, in fact, find a set of common patterns, differentiation and division of labor, basically methods to manage individual group conflicts, loss of reproductive capacity for individual agents, and new routes of information transmission. So when I read this, I was just absolutely floored. And I imagine some of you had a similar experience, depending on when you came across it. I came across it in graduate school. And since the major transitions, the major transitions sort of literature has sort of given birth to a whole new sort of subgenre, which is this evolutionary transitions in individuality, which is more precise, does not include, for example, the emergence of sexual reproduction, among other things. The fundamental components here is that it describes an long-term evolutionary process in which solitary individuals come to be clustered and cooperate in these groups. Then over long periods of time, as the fates of these groups tend to be connected, a process of group selection works on them, and after a long enough period of time can create a population of individuals which are the descendants of what used to be groups, but are now instead a new level of individual made of parts which used to be individuals, but are now non-autonomous components of the whole. Finally, in the last stage, these pieces, which are descended from individuals in the evolutionary past, will often lose complexity in a process that's called de-Darwinization or complexity drain as they become increasingly integrated. So there are a number of examples of this, of course, eukaryotes being one of the first one from Lynn Margulis. An excellent example of a between species evolutionary transition in individuality. I will start using ETI to mean evolutionary transition of individuality. And so I should just let you know. Multicellular organisms, of course, is another example. They're all around us. We're very familiar with these. And some great work on algae from Rich Michaud. The Volvocene algae, showing the evolution of multicellularity in that lineage, as well as experimental work on yeast, being able to sort of rewind and change the conditions for the evolution of multicellularity. So there's this really amazing work with multicellularity. So for being able to demonstrate within species evolutionary transitions and individuality. I'm not going to spend my time here, though, because the point is to talk about humans. And so, of course, we come to the last exemplar case, right? And this is eusocial insects. And eusocial insects have a number of interesting features that may feel familiar. They have city-states, reliance on agriculture, full-time complex division of labor. They share information in novel ways, usually chemical and pheromones. They have self-sacrifice for collective defense, and most amazingly, perhaps, reproductive specialization and sterile casts. So, everyone is amazed by these things when you see them and when you think about them. And I think every human also thinks, that's interesting. That's very similar. So put a little piece on here. There's some mathematical theory, and thank you to Mauricio for pointing this out, because he caused me to go back and look at that 25 paper. There it is. that just supports the proposition that an evolutionary transition in individuality leading to a eusocial species with castes can really provide a sort of formal justification for understanding the emergence of an evolutionary individual at the next level. And then that sort of takes the next step beyond some of his prior work on the topic, which is exciting. So it seems to me that we have this possibility of a recipe, right? Okay, we have the recipe here. How to bake a superorganism: assemble one large population, divide into small stable groups, blend each group to homogenize, sprinkle in between group variation, and compete the groups on high selection for 50,000 generations. I don't know, something like this, right? Can you do this, right? And if that's the case, has that been happening to humans? And what does that mean? And what's different? We certainly aren't insects, right? And yet, are we undergoing an ETI? We have city-states, right? We have reliance on agriculture at a very novel scale. We have full-time complex division of labor. Here you all are not getting food for yourselves. We have very crazy modes of information transmission. Hello, everybody online, right? We have self-sacrifice for collective defense. And the one piece that we don't have is this reproductive specialization beyond our sexual reproduction, right? So whoa, already looks pretty close according to at least this list. So this is the question that I want to wrestle with, and that the field here also struggles to study and argues about a lot. So I'm going to try to give you a little flavor of some of the research in the field here before transitioning into where I think some pieces can go. This is this wonderful design for a workshop held by my friend and colleague Yochai Carmel at Technion. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it went virtual. But perhaps that was completely appropriate considering the nature here. But just take a look at this image, right? It's a great image. But also it's showing that humans are sort of becoming a multicellular glob, right? Some horror movie thing, right? And that's fun and everything. But that's also not what we're talking about, right? So I'll come back to that. So the research, I'm happy to say, on this topic has been picking up recently. I think it's beginning to attract more attention and some more rigor, which I'm excited about. But I also, as we pivot into the next piece here, I want you to keep in mind this question of, are we making comparisons to biological cases and biological evolutionary transitions, or are we making analogies? Because that difference is really important, and I'm hopeful that the philosophers are with me here. And I don't think that we have to do one or the other, but I think we need to at least know when we're doing which one. So here's a piece from Yochai's paper in that special issue, where he looks at, I should say, and the reason I put this up is because it's data, which is basically the first paper in this little field to actually say, here we have some data and it's relevant, right? He uses three pieces of information: size, specialization, and inseparability, as a way to make the argument that humanity may be have gone through some type of evolutionary transition in individuality. Now, his data aren't great, and he acknowledges that, and yet here we go. Here we are. This is a time where he argues there is some significant degree of inseparability because of the specialization of roles in society. So he would strongly say this is a comparison, not an analogy. On the other hand, for me personally, if we take this Anderson and Tornberg paper, they make an argument, a rather interesting and somewhat complex argument, that early hominins had social groups that split, and that splitting process of a social protocell created a thing that sort of mimics what we see with phospholipid bilayers. Now, for those of us who study human patterns, we know that humans move in and out of groups all the time, taking culture with them, changing identities as they do sometimes. And so the question of whether this is an analogy and maybe not an appropriate one is, I think, is important. When I first saw this, I thought, no, Klaus is wrong. I don't think we have social protocells, and I don't think we split like this. It's not so clean. And so I'm going to let you decide. You can read this paper, but I will come back to related questions. Klaus is also on another paper with a colleague of mine, Claudio Tenier. And this paper is a really neat one, where they take a look at the question of cultural adaptation and cumulative cultural evolution. Cumulative cultural evolution is the idea that over long periods of time, we refine and develop and complexify our culture in order to achieve higher performance in various tasks. And so the typical model of that is an intensive model, right? So it happens among individuals, right, within a population. I learn something, right, from Gerd, and I then improve on it a little bit. And then, other people learn that from me, and Sanjay learns that from them, and he improves on it a lot, and so on. And so the quality of individual level culture and complexity of culture is improving over time, so that you are the recipient of culture that it took many generations to refine, right? So that's wonderful, and it certainly happens. The argument here, though, is that that's a different dimension than what they call extensive cumulativity, right? So culture that links up between individuals, right? And so this is a really interesting argument, and it relates to how we understand human change in the last, maybe, I guess, all of humanity, starting from hominin relatives, ape-like culture. The question is, how do you get to human culture? And their point is, well, we could have had intensive culture first. You don't need to read all the words. Don't read all the words. Too many words. So individuals gaining more and more complex and sophisticated culture over time at the individual level, and then that becoming more complex in the group structured way, building institutions and language and the rest sort of afterwards. Or it could have gone the other way around, right? So institutions and social identity and social bonding coming first, and then complex adaptive culture, cumulative culture coming afterwards. The point here is not that I know which of these it is, or that I think that we necessarily have great evidence that we have one or the other, but this is a hypothesis that should be testable to some degree in different ways. So that's something that I hope we get to do. Of course, it does actually build on this idea of having a social protocell where you have a group of people perhaps with some identity or cultural traits that then sort of diverges over time, which again, I was skeptical of. But then I thought, oh yeah, right, I have been living in the United States for the last, my entire life. And it's been undergoing a process which looks a lot like this, right? Notice they don't have the 2024. I was looking for that and I couldn't find it. Maybe I don't want to see it. But anyway, sorry to be dark. But right, this happens, right? Groups do split sometimes. Is that enough to be an evolutionarily relevant process, right? Evolutionarily relevant for what? For genes or for culture, right? Does it matter? Yes. So let's keep going. So that's a sampling of a few pieces of work in the field. And now what I'd like to do is to give you a perspective on some of the challenges, including some of the philosophical challenges that people run across when they try to tackle this problem. There's questions of logical consistency, right? Is this a logical possibility? Does it even make sense? The questions of the empirical status. Has a human ETI happened already? Is it not happening? Has it happened in the past? Is it ongoing? What are the mechanisms? How relevant is it? Up here, what counts as the unit of selection? People are trying to explain different processes. So I'll give you a flavor of this by giving you two papers which criticize some of my own. And they're both good because they're trying to be very clear about definitions. The first one here, Dan McShay in 23 rather, says no, it's not a logical possibility. And he has 4 reasons. Human hierarchy isn't hierarchical enough. Honestly, I don't understand that. If I went back and read the thing, I think I would understand. But even still, I think we've got plenty of hierarchy. The division of labor is behavioral and cultural rather than morphological. Okay, I would give that a check as well. That's true. Then he also says natural selection operates in 3 modes, stability, growth, and reproductive success, and it's only the latter which builds complexity. And human societies, probably evolved mainly in the growth and stability modes. I underlined and colored mainly, because if it's not categorically the case, then that means sometimes they do. And if sometimes they do, then those times are going to matter, right? Just want to put that in there. We'll come back to that as well. And then little evidence of de-Darwinization or complexity. So it's clear here what Dan is doing is he's looking at this as a biological transition, right? Perhaps even a genetic one. Arsham Korki also says no. Similar argument to McShay. Many features match. There's the multi-level organization. There's cooperation, the division of labor, and so on. But social systems typically lack autonomous reproduction at the group level. So this is this stumbling block for both cases, which I think is, I'm glad that they have pointed this out. What I will say, however, is that what they're concluding here is not, well, they conclude that it's not a logical possibility, right? It's some kind of category error. However, they acknowledge a bunch of facts, match the pattern. They make kind of these evidence-based arguments, which is fine. But in both cases, they're sort of missing aspects of what cultural inheritance might do, right? Division of labor is behavioral. Well, but is labor divided? Labor is divided. And so we will come back to this point. Also, perhaps missing the operation of selection. If societies typically lack sort of, differential, growth and reproduction, but sometimes it happens, those sometimes will certainly matter. So, and finally, I want to say, seems that they may be lacking the idea here of a transition that could be ongoing. Let's continue. There are other vague definitions and sort of different targets of explanation here too. So for example, Selene Kesavir in 2012, it sort of uses the superorganism metaphor and says, well, actually, if you look at human psychology, you see a bunch of things that really kind of line up with sort of superorganism stuff. So it's kind of like being willing to take the ball halfway down the court and just leave it there and then walk off, right? So it's sort of like, okay, that was exciting or interesting. What does it mean? And this is the kind of thing that makes biologists very frustrated, right? Because is it or is it not? Then on the other hand, we have other things that people are trying to explain, right? Biologists are trying to explain biological organization, as we should. But we also have social scientists and biologists who will say maybe language is the thing, right? Language is the outcome of a transition, or perhaps society itself is the transition, or maybe it's the economy, not society, but the economy. Well, what is it? The economy, at least you can count resources, material, energy. So we're talking about sort of biological or ecological flows. But this is a problem, right? We're trying to explain different things. In addition, there's confusion about where it is, right? So some say, well, yeah, there was the transition is complete. It has happened. Some say, well, no, it has stalled. Stearns 2007 says, no, humans are far too genetically admixed. We are never going to go through genetic group selection. We're only getting more and more mixed. So this doesn't work. We are stalled. And there's related ideas. These guys say, no, it's not applicable. And then, some people say, well, maybe it's ongoing. So a bunch of problems that have not been solved here. So, and one nice way to focus on what this is biologists being frustrated, right? Either saying it's not applicable, right? Or it's incomplete, but it's stalled because it doesn't match the pattern of a genetic ETI. Okay. And so it needs to stay grounded in genetic evolution to some degree. Social scientists, on the other hand, have this other thing, right? They're saying, look, we are looking at a thing that is best described as a superorganism, a crude superorganism, to use Boyd and Richardson's term. The thing is happening. It's there, right? It's the global economy. It's a city. You pick your slice. It's happened. We're studying it. That's the thing. But then many may have occurred. Society, culture, its institutions. So it is about understanding and explaining the processes, but maybe not quite being able to make the connection back to what are the units of selection. So this gives us a tale of two transitions, right? The biologists are seeing this, and they are saying, no, a genetic ETI is not happening, right? Whereas the social scientists and the anthropologists are seeing this, individuals, right? Forming into societies. And they're saying, yes, that has happened. And it keeps happening again and again. The problem is these things are, wait, there we go. How do they relate? Are they related? Are they not related? And so this is my starting point for my entry into this field and this literature. And I think there's a bit of a consensus here too, which is emerging. The first is that ETI theory generally applies to humans in at least some ways. At least there are empirical patterns that match, right? And so we need to understand them. The application is certainly, would be certainly unique. Everyone would agree on that. If it applies at all, it would have to be unique. And also, cultural inheritance is clearly involved in some way, right? Society, language, institutions, technology, economic structures, right? Organizations seem to be the thing in there. So now what? I take this as requiring two things for advancement in this little domain. The first is taking culture seriously to make the social scientists happy, right? And the anthropologists happy. And the second is taking basically, the mechanics of ecology and biology and resources and reproduction and fitness seriously to make the biologists happy. Of course, it would also be nice if we started using some data. And it would also be nice if we had some models. Well, so this is where I think we're heading. And so now I'll get to introduce what I've been working on and where I'm going with this. My addition to the literature is this evolutionary transition in inheritance and individuality. So two I's. Sorry, it's maybe awkward. I've had friends say, your ET2 hypothesis. It's not ET2, it's ETII. So it's not like a second movie about the extraterrestrial. So number one, let's take cultural inheritance seriously. So we have a rich literature on cultural evolution. Cultural evolution gives us a very clear way of understanding the ways in which human culture, the patterns of transmission of human culture, are very different from those of genes. And to put a point on it, I'm not going to belabor here, and we can talk about it later, that culture can convey lots of adaptive information. But thinking that gives us the ability to think about individuals, humans, as having two types of inheritance, genes and culture. And it's worth, I think, thinking about how very different these inheritance systems are, right? So genetic inheritance is an inheritance where you get information passively given to you. You have no choice, right? It's put into you when you are created, right? And the storage medium is physically replicated, and the child passively receives the traits. Whereas with culture, it's extremely different, right? Instead, what we have is a complex inferential process on the part of the receiver, right? So I watch Hari and I see what he's doing, and I figure out why he's doing that in the environment he's doing it in. And then I decide that that's exactly the wrong thing for a certain set of reasons that apply to my case, and I do the opposite, right? And so that's really complicated. Is that inheritance, or is that just learning? Well, yeah, right? The point is, the difference could hardly be larger between these two types of inheritance mechanisms. And so we should not expect that patterns of evolution, adaptation, group maintenance, and the rest are also going to be parallel, because they won't be parallel. They'll be different. This is my favorite quip, so I love to put it in here. Lumsden and Wilson, 1881, in their Genes, Mind, and Culture book, gene culture coevolution was becoming a thing. And so they said, well, look, genetic natural selection operates in such a way as to hold culture on a leash. It can't go anywhere. It can't go crazy, right? And so I thought, really? That seems weird, because if you look around us, it seems pretty crazy. And I think there's some science backs this up, right? Cultural evolution is not only cumulative, which has been measured more and more in different ways, is notably, from the evidence that we have, faster than genetic evolution, which is surprising because we can transmit ideas over the course of a few seconds. Now, of course, some culture may be transmitted over longer periods of time, but it can still be quite fast. And so maybe a large fraction of human adaptation is cultural. And then we have cumulative cultural evolution building up in, for example, stone tool use over time, going back to the beginning of the stone tool record, coming all the way to, at some point, around 300,000 years ago, crossing the boundary of the level where primates can achieve. Is it primates, or is it humans? Yeah, non-human primate technology. The most complex is the 6 procedural units right there. So the idea is we started to inherit cultural processes for making, just in this case, stone tools, that made those stone tools more and more and more complex. And of course, it's processes like that that allowed people to populate crazy and desperate parts of the world, like, for example, going hunting on a body of liquid death, right? In boats made out of bone and skin and wood, right? Surviving in the Arctic is extreme, and the technology required to do so is extremely sophisticated. And yet there we go. And that's very different from the technology that we created in the Kalahari, right? Extremely different. And so we do not see a lot of genetic adaptation causing these differences of being able to persist in these different environments. Instead, we see cultural adaptation. Now, so my take is the other way around, right? Here's what's happening, right, with genes and culture. Yeah, sure, there's a leash. Yep. But so to me, what this means is this is our hint, right? And it's a pretty big hint because it's all around us. Look, you're inside the thing, right? It's raining. Is anyone wet? Not. Okay. Is that because of your genes? No, it's not because of your genes. It's because we're in a giant shell. And it's toasty and warm in here too. So this is a hint to me that we are experiencing some kind of inheritance transition. More and more of what makes us successful, wealthy, healthy, even influences our reproductive success, happens to do with culture that we have inherited that allows us to flourish and do well. Jablonka pointed this out in 94, by the way, and this theme has not been picked up very well. Inheritance transitions have not been very well studied. We don't have any good models, and we don't have a lot of, they're hard to study, I think, because they're probably quite rare. But how would an inheritance transition in humans unfold? I think if you start with, genotype to extended phenotype and environmental interactions from genetic individuals, and you want to go all the way to whatever this cultural superorganism is, right? You have to go through a series of stages, right? First, it's probably millions of years, right? We don't know where we are in here. But then slowly we can imagine a series of stages where first, the ability to have culture emerges, right, on the genetic platform, and then it becomes more and more important as it gains adaptive information, right, tools and language, social structure, other behaviors, and then finally starts to become more important than genes themselves in determining outcomes, right, and determining evolutionary outcomes. Well, we've started modeling this stuff, and an inheritance transition is tricky to model. So we're focusing on sort of the simplest possible version of this, which is a process of fitness export. There are no models of fitness export either. It was first designed, the term comes from Michaud and Heron, who are talking about fitness export from individuals to groups. We're instead using fitness export sort of between inheritance systems, between reservoirs of information. And we have a very simple joint fitness function, right? You have to have a joint fitness function because you have two dimensions of adaptation. Well, if you have two dimensions of adaptation, this nice little one gives you a way where if I have a high score in, say, my ability to withstand the sun, and I have nice dark skin, then I maybe don't need as much clothing or sunscreen, right? And if I put the clothing or sunscreen on, it doesn't actually have any effect, right? So what that means is the cultural evolutionary impact is removed, right? There's very hard for people to learn that using sunscreen is a good idea if everyone in the population already has nice dark skin, right? It weakens the selection on the alternative inheritance sort of system, right, or reservoir for that trait. So, and there are a number of different inheritance systems that this stuff may apply to, right? The RNA DNA transition, epigenetic inheritance, stuff in the gut microbiome, right? If you are in an environment where you can these things transmitted, different types of mutualisms, of course, culture. And so we build some models of this and take a look at a number of different scenarios where simple inheritance transitions for small it can occur. And here are some of our scenarios. And a number of them apply quite a bit to this story we're telling about cultural inheritance, right? Number one, a greater frequency of adaptive mutations, right? If in culture, we tend to not just wait for random changes, but rather intentionally make innovations on our practices as we do, then, we have greater frequency of adaptive mutations, right? So if that happens, then we do actually see some of these. This plot, by the way, is the default state where they're exactly the same. The reservoir A could be culture and reservoir B could be genetics. And if you start here with neither in either case, you end up with sort of half of the simulations going one way and half of the simulations going the other way. And you just have one or the other because they're the same, right? Also, allowing horizontal transmission to evolve also causes a transition. And I'll show you here. Here's an example from the greater frequency of adaptive mutation scenario. Here we start with a fully genetically evolving population and allow culture to occur. But what we do, how do I do this? There we go. But it starts with a mean value of 0, right? But it has greater adaptive, more frequent adaptive mutations. And so slowly over time, some adaptive value builds up, right, in culture, while genes are staying quite high. But after a certain point, somewhere around 0.5, they start to be able to lose some of the genetic value, right? And as they lose that genetic component of fitness from that reservoir, it starts off this sort of horizontal slide until eventually they get to the point where the situation is reversed. There's now basically 100% of the adaptive value is in culture, and a good amount is sort of redundant amount is still in genes. And then here, finally, we get a transition all the way down. Here's what the individual simulations look like for genes and culture in one-dimensional plots over time. So the idea here is that, you know, an inheritance transition is very possible, right? At least in theory, right? According to this, you know, very first simple model. That's step one. Step two is take the group dynamics and group evolution seriously. So as Stearns pointed out, genetic group selection on humans is not going to happen. However, culture is dramatically more group structured than genes. Here's an FST plot. Here's genes, it's really not, and here's culture, quite a bit. Cultural group selection is argued to be strong, as argued to drive human cooperation. It's still really hard to measure human cultural group selection for all sorts of reasons. The primary reason is that it's really hard to get all the data, because you need to be able to compare it to individual behavior and have individual behavior and outcome. Sorry, it's a thing. And you need group behavior and group outcomes, and you need these things over time within a population of groups. So it's just the data thing is a huge problem. However, if it did happen, it really would help explain things like the emergence of effective institutions, right? The evolution of sophisticated infrastructure systems. So what I want to say here is, well, I guess I'll say that later. So here we get to no, I'll say it now. So imagine, for example, no, I'll say it later. Sorry. Okay. So here we get to the fundamental mechanism underlying our sort of hypothesis, right? And that is the adaptive value of culture seems to, on its own, be able to drive an inheritance transition, right? To at least some degree, possibly all the way. Who knows what this means? But it also influences the power and proliferation of culturally organized groups, right? Societies, organizations, whatever. These things feed back on each other because groups have more minds, and so more minds can solve more problems more rapidly. This is a well-known thing in evolutionary anthropology and economics as well. So that creates a process, possibly, of an individuality transition. So it comes as a result of the inheritance transition, and this is the coupled evolutionary transition that we're talking about with an ETII, from genetic individuals to cultural superorganisms, right? So what does this mean? How would this unfold, right? Now we can answer this. We have two dimensions. The answer is it doesn't go this way, right? It's not a genetic process, but rather it's a cross inheritance system process. So we're looking at changing the level of organization and changing the primary mode of inheritance at the same time. So here we can just add this figure. This is a nice thing. This comes from Okasha. It's wonderful, 2005. It's a nice little way to think about multi-level selection 1 and 2. I'm going to just charge on. So my colleague, Zach Wood, and I thought, well, there's probably evidence in gene culture coevolution literature. There's not a lot of research in gene culture coevolution. There's some. And of course, the one you're most familiar with is the one everyone is familiar with because it's the most well-studied. And it's the lactase persistence and dairying idea, where somewhere around, it's 20,000 years ago, in Northern Europe, we see evidence of a group of people being able to drink milk from cattle and also having the gene that allows them to express the lactose digestive enzyme. And those people spread, and with them both the culture and the gene spread. So this is this nice feedback process between a basically well-isolated group of traits for the genetic side and an isolated group of traits on the cultural side. So this is our default mode of thinking about what gene culture coevolution is. A genetic trait and a cultural trait, and they're mutualistic. Cool. But that model of thinking about what gene culture coevolution is has put blinders on the field in terms of what we've been looking for. And it's been tricky. What's nice here is you can take this case, this highlighted case, and say, well, how did this go? What's the outcome of this? Well, this is what modern dairying looks like, right? Not all modern dairying. I know, yes, the Swiss have some really, they keep it in the fields and everything, right? But this is, right? Good Lord, right? This is industrial, right? Which means what? It means it's culturally organized. It's organized by groups of humans. An individual human is not capable of running or maintaining this entire thing. It's a group level process. It's technological, there's complex organization, large scale production, all built in within a system of trade. And so then, the way we consume is like this. And I put the Japanese up here because of this very interesting point. Brett Beheim at Leipzig has done some studies on this, although he has not published it. Folks in Japan generally are lactose intolerant, and yet they drink a lot of milk. Why is that? Well, they can produce a lot of milk, and they like milk. And so they're drinking it. They do get nutrition from it, but they exhale a little bit of extra hydrogen, right? So this is a case where the culture has gone way beyond the gene, right? An exact example of some of the things we're talking about here. So, and as a result of large-scale industrial group-organized cultural processes. Oops, did it say? It was supposed to say, which I will call cultural preemption. So what we did is we sort of went through the gene culture coevolution literature to try to see what patterns existed between these two, right? And so first, there are two types of gene culture coevolution that have been studied in the literature, and good Lord. I may not do the application piece. The first is the emergence of culture in the first place. This is when we have key genetically determined capacities, pardon me, brain size, maybe, I don't know, but social abilities, right? Linguistic abilities, other cognitive abilities that allow us to be cultural needed to evolve within our biological system. There's some key traits here. And so this is highly gene limited. You need to wait for those mutations to come before you unlock the ability to have cultural inheritance at all in the first place. You don't get fancy imitative machinery in your big brain unless you have grown one in the first place. So the set of examples around that, again, mostly arguments. Then there are sort of very few here, lactase and eating dairy, of sort of mutualistic ones. So we add a third, and we add this category of cultural preemption, where what happens is we have a cultural trait a small, well-isolated set of cultural traits, a single cultural system that has the ability to influence the entire genetic inheritance system. This is just the reverse of what was happening up here, right? So down here, what are we thinking about? We're thinking about reproductive medicine, right? Science, infrastructure, trade, keeping people alive, right? And so these sorts of cultural traits should also count as a type of gene culture coevolution. And so this is a new category. So we can look at the classic examples, stage 1, the emergence of species typical stuff, stage 2, some stuff that isn't maybe species typical because maybe some populations don't, drink milk so much or whatever, but actually some of these maybe it should be species typical. Maybe this is the only one that sort of, there's very few actually in stage 2 by any reasonable accounting. I'm not sure why these are down here. And then we have what we call cultural preemption or preemptive cultural adaptation, where group level technologies and social systems are so fast, they often are getting way ahead of genes. Sometimes they even cause conflict with prior genetic adaptations. Then what happens? Well, that would be a good example of a case where you could see, well, does genes solve the problem or does culture solve the problem? Well, guess what? Culture solves the problem, right? Again and again and again. So we can take a few of these here. One of my favorite ones is this one. This is something I came across myself. Dental hygiene happens, right? And that means we actually keep our teeth longer, probably, I argue, I think. I haven't published on this, so, the dental experts maybe shoot me down. Longer than we would otherwise, and we were already keeping our teeth for a long time, which is why we have already very delayed wisdom tooth third molar eruption, very delayed, comes in our 20s, way longer than other primates, but it's still not long enough, and so we just pull them out, right? This is crazy. This is a cultural solution to a problem that is a conflict between a cultural adaptation and a genetic adaptation. We can see other ones here too. My most sort of exciting and I think strongest case is, of course, Mitterrocker et al., the case of reproductive medicine, cesarean section being a really powerful example of the way in which cultural supports influence both genes and culture over time. And so cesarean section, women who have been the product of cesarean section are more likely to be able, more likely to themselves require cesarean section, et cetera. So this should be no surprise, right? We created hospitals and medical science in order to keep people alive, right? That's the point. Right? So this is good. We need to understand what the implications are and how our systems evolve as a result. So we see evidence of all three, maybe not so much of mutualistic because it was probably a quick slide through that period. And so we estimate that we're here somewhere in the beginning of phase 3, which is interesting because things seem to still be accelerating, right? So that's, I think, important. I want to take a peek at my time. I'm coming up to the end here, and I'll probably have to pull off my example. But this gives us some core predictions, though. Inheritance predictions and individuality predictions, both. Basically, more cultural inheritance relative to genes and the importance of, and the importance of groups going up relative to individuals, right, in determining fitness, for example. So inheritance predictions, the accumulation of traits with cultural dependence, right? Glasses, right? Me not knowing how to farm, that's a joke. That's not a genetic trait. Reduced selection for individual genetic reproduction specifically. This is interesting. How would that come about? I'm happy to talk more. Increased group level support for and control over biological reproduction, child-rearing education, and role specialization. For example, China's one-child policy. We see all sorts of policies for reproduction. But societies are now at the stage of needing to manage their population size. Sometimes too small. They're not maintaining population. Sometimes they're growing too much, right? So this is a ubiquitous problem. Managing it is tricky. Guess what? We're beginning to see policies and systems for doing this. Increased importance of cultural group identity over kin-based identity. Individuality predictions, similarly, increased outsourcing of sort of one's extended phenotype to the group. So, for example, when you turn on the water in the sink, you are connecting to a group level system, right? The electricity, when you invest in a bank or something, all of these are things that provide group level infrastructure, and group level infrastructure is connecting your fitness outcomes or the inputs to your fitness outcomes to the group. Increasingly integrated, efficient groups, and increasing group identification and differentiation. So we have a research agenda here that emerges from this set of theory. We're working on building models. We want to test about the internal validity. We would like to know, questions. For example, how strong is cultural group selection in humans in different domains? Can we measure it? How can we measure it? What are the constraints and requirements for an ETII? In what cases does this work? For example, what are the Darwinian parameters necessary, et cetera? Most importantly, we need to test the predictions, not just these predictions that I put up here, the two major predictions of change in inheritance system and change in level of organization. Those are the fundamental predictions. Those other ones are stuff that we cooked up, and I would invite you to develop better ones, please. So we need to start using some data. We're now at 1 hour, and so what I'm going to do is go rapidly through a final application example, but you can read the paper. Before I do that, on the way, I want to ask you, okay, if we are in the middle of a process that is slowly changing our species from being largely sort of genetic individuals into being what we might think of as cultural superorganisms, that's kind of hard to imagine, right? So think for a moment, what does that look like? What do you see when you hear that, or when you allow yourself to think that? Do tell me, does anyone have any ideas? What do you see? What does that mean? It may be creepy, it may be nasty, it may be beautiful, but any thoughts? You don't have to have a thought, please.
I'm thinking that isn't it like thinking of ourselves as individuals, isn't it like something like from Western societies that was not necessarily the way people from other societies that were very communists were thinking. And maybe it's not such a
well, sure, yeah. But this is a question for after, because the answer is longer. I was looking for something simple. What do you see? Do you see us all merging into well, I think one of the things I see is this movie, right? The Matrix, right? He wakes up, right? He's in society, but society is run by machines, right? He's in a pod, right? It's gross. Humans are completely controlled, right? So I mention this because it's important. Why is it important? It's important because our visions of our future currently, I think, are rather limited. And I think they're kind of limited in part because our understanding of ourselves is limited. We have versions of humans going through evolutionary transitions that aren't so pretty. And I'd like to have versions of this type of narrative, right, type of story, which are beneficial, which are nice. Which brings me to the final point here, and I'll keep this brief. That ethics still matters, and it matters especially, I think, for those of us who are trying to study human evolution, particularly if you're not just studying the evolution of a particular genetic trait or a particular cultural trait, but you're trying to study this long-term process. Peter Turchin is famous for the argument that warfare has probably had a huge impact on human cooperation, making us more cooperative within our societies and less cooperative between. That still happens and it still matters. And just because we are studying these things doesn't mean we should not have a principled and robust applied ethics program that accompanies it. I really believe that we should. Specifically, we should still be scientists. We're not talking about, creating some sort of teleological perspective on human change. We want to describe it in as objective a way as we can. However, we can and should also be against war, right? And I think that you can use evolutionary principles and thinking to be concrete about that. Similarly, racism, right? And ethnocentrism. Racism and ethnocentrism are probably the result of cultural group selection in a way, right? Competition between groups that makes us predisposed or very easy to start judging other people who look different, right? But we can use our understanding of the cultural evolution of racist dogma or actions and beliefs to try to counter them, and we should. With that in mind, I just want to say that the other component of what I do is this thing. I try to find ways to apply cultural evolution in particular, and maybe even ETII thinking towards beneficial social change. That's a different talk. I'm not going to give you a slice of the talk that is right here, but it's got some cool pictures like this. And so with that, I'll just sort of end with what I think is useful here is the theory that we need is also related in my mind to the story that we need, particularly now in the Anthropocene where we're torching the planet and still killing ourselves. I think we need better answers to these questions, and I think they need to be the same answer, and I think we need to talk across disciplines to do that. And I think it also needs to be understandable by the public at large, because we're still doing some of those things that got us into the problems in the first place. So I'm going to end right there. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention.
I'll moderate the questions for you.
Great.
I'm sure there are many.
Great.
Questions for Tim. Let him have a sip of water, and then Sanjay can start. Sanjay, this is the room, right? Sitting there in front of you, so please speak up a little bit.
Okay.
And I saw you carry your mic.
Thanks for a really nice talk. I don't have, just as a disclaimer, I don't have much exposure to this part of the field, of course. So I'm going to be saying something in the language I understand.
Perfect.
So
that's all we can ever do.
Yes. So for this superorganism stuff,
yeah.
Just going off the question that you asked about what we might think of the future. I don't know. There was this piece I wrote like 4 or 5 years back. It's very juvenile, and then I trashed it because I thought it was juvenile. But there it was basically analyzing society to a human or any organism, where you have each individual cell doing the division of labor of roles.
Yes.
So if, for example, a cell in my body thought, I don't want to do this, it's a shitty role. And,
it doesn't have a choice, does it?
Doesn't have a choice.
It can't reassign itself.
Yeah. So basically,
it has a job of doing its work and dying, or going rogue.
Yes.
And becoming cancer for a little while.
Exactly.
Maybe taking the system down with it.
Exactly. And quite often it's quite successful at bringing the system down.
Sure.
So, but for the most part, there is still enough, local incentive for those cells to do what they do. That's what allows this superorganism to be stable. So if we were to envision a future where we wanted like a group of humans to, create a cultural, not just cultural, but maybe even genetic, but on some level, create a superorganism, what would its role be? And is it just to innovate and to push the boundaries of our existence and to propagate ourselves? Is it kind of this Elon Musk-ized version of why should humans exist on the planet? And if so, individuals are also getting more and more. There is more freedom with wealth, and so people basically will never have. You can never tell people you're born. You should train in a technical school, learn only this, and do this for the rest of your life.
Right.
That's not going to happen.
Yep.
More or less, people are going to explore more.
Yep.
So this kind of a system, it's very difficult to think of any situation where you have a stable superorganism coming up at all.
So there's a lot in your question, but I think if I put aside and integrate it, so a lot of the pieces you're asking, can it be stable in part because it's cultural, right? Is that part of it, right?
No, so it's.
Can it be stable? Is that you?
Stable.
Because I can also go through and answer the.
Yeah, in order to be stable, you need to have some people to do something constantly all the time.
Yeah.
Right. So, and if that's already gone, the incentive to do that is already gone because you have options to do anything.
Right. Well, let me just dive into this piece here because I think the analogy is good and it's useful to do analogies because we learn by doing them, right? And then of course we go beyond them. So we do not have, as McShay points out, right, genetic division of labor. Instead, we have division of labor, which is culturally programmed. Well, how do we do that culturally? Well, we're in the middle of culturally programming some of it right now. You guys are going to go out and be awesome scientists and things, right? And so that's different, right? How do we do that, right? As societies, well, you might say, well, we have an, organ, right? We have educational institutions. We also have sort of, parental transmission, right? But people end up, we take, to again analogize cells of individuals, program them culturally through various types of exposure to society and carefully structured groups with very specific ideas about what comes afterwards. And then people flow into society and play those roles, right? So that's different, right? It's similar, but it is different because I could decide, this scientist thing is too much. I'm not going to do it anymore. I hate committee meetings in particular. I'm going to, go be something else. Yeah, so it is different. Does it mean that there's some fundamental difference for stability? Your question? Maybe.
So then coming back,
maybe we need to move on to there's a couple of people with questions.
Yeah.
Carrie is next.
Thanks. So that was very provocative.
Good.
Which it should be. So I just want to raise what seems to be an inconsistency.
Please.
So first of all, the logical endpoint seems to be eugenics of this, right? Where culture just imposes genetic changes by ruling out certain genetic pools and others, right? That's the sort of logical endpoint of this. You haven't mentioned eugenics, but it's obviously there, right? But that sort of, you sort of skimmed over racism at the end, which is one way of imposing.
I would like to say that I address racism directly. Skim over it.
That, on the one hand, the idea that culture, would overcome genetic evolution is
yes.
The word eugenics. But on the other hand, the very moral system that we all sort of, oppose, think eugenics is a terrible thing,
right.
That we should let individuality, flourish.
Yeah.
Seems to be exactly the opposite, running in the opposite direction, where we should, not be imposing different views of, that any sort of disability, any sort of non-standard,
yeah, right.
whatever,
Sure.
should flourish. And that's exactly the opposite of what happens with a superorganism, where people get their fixed roles and they stay there, and that's that.
Sure, I do see what you mean, and I take your point. So if we can think just for a second of the RNA DNA transition, right? So which is poorly understood because we don't have any direct evidence, but it is likely that we did, start with proteins and RNA and DNA. It looks like was probably basically more stable in the long term, and so it sort of basically became the long-term storage unit. So RNA didn't go anywhere. It's still there. It still plays an important role. It still plays a heredity role as well, but it plays a key role in development and growth of cells, regulation of cells. Right. So, what are we thinking of here? Right. How do genes become involved in the operation of a cultural superorganism? Well, number one, we don't know what a cultural superorganism is. Right. So, one of the questions is, does a cultural superorganism include us, right? So it's reasonable to think right now, oh, good Lord, AI, is it going to replace us, right? There's literally talk about that in the public sphere, right? So yeah, if it did, that would be the transition, right? It is a group level cultural product. Is it capable of doing all of the things it needs to do in order to replace humans? Certainly not today. So yeah, but the point is there are many different ways that this could go, right? And we don't know what potential cultural superorganisms might be like. One of the things that you're pointing at when you point to eugenics is eugenics typically is a very simplistic concept around the idea of a certain race that is better than other races, right? And therefore, the group of people have an identity, and they want to eliminate people based on this physical characteristic. So the way in which genes would probably be entrained in a cultural system would not be the same way, right? In part because if you were going to use morphological differences in genes, which I kind of mostly doubt that you wouldn't just sort of get rid of the variation. Instead, you'd do something that's like creating insect castes, right? You'd have the big, strong things. You'd have the people that do, farming, and the people that, climb on buildings and whatever, right? I don't think that's likely either, because genes don't seem to be the fast way to engineer human behavior, which is where the action is. So yeah, you're right. Eugenics is in this space, right? The conflict that you noted, I think, ultimately is between my own values, not liking eugenics, and the fact that these things tend to point in the direction where genes and culture become increasingly connected, with culture in the driver's seat, right? So, but again, we already see this happening. Number one, we are doing that in some ways, and number two, we already genetically modify the plants and organisms we interact with all the time, right? So crop species and the like. In probably almost all of our lives, we're going to learn about, the first genetically engineered humans of some special type, right? So the challenge is to distinguish, right, what my values are from, the mechanisms that are happening. Yeah.
Philip has a question.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting and talk, right? I have two comments, one on your comment and one on your talk, right? So I clearly see why you're mentioning eugenics here, but luckily I don't see that happening, right? I mean, world is still not as just as we would like it to be. But I mean, in a way, modern technology and sort of medicine and everything is rather going in the direction to making basically survival rates more equal, right? And not determined by some ideological idea, which is basically eugenics. So I mean, with all pessimism that is here, the Viennese, I still not see that happen. But
I want to add to your point, but go ahead.
The second thing is that it's interesting how you mention or how you portray sort of the cultural dynamics are sort of taking increasing role in inheritance systems, right? And how there is or might be an ongoing shift. But I wonder whether that something is, well, these dynamics are, completely taking over, or because to me, there are different properties of humans. I mean, individual humans, genetic aspects, physical aspects, traits, right? In the classical, if you like, in many cognitive, behavioral, sociological properties, right? And I can see for these different properties, different dynamics. While some are more still governed by sort of classic, genetic transmission, and others they are more complementary or whereas obviously in many of our cultural behaviors there is superorganism, right?
Yeah.
So
right.
I wonder how useful it is to portray this as an either or sort of one system governing everything that is human.
I mean, that's an excellent critique. Of course, you're right. It's different in different domains. But I do like to summarize, and I think, certain domains, maybe it's going to move faster. Other domains, it won't. Other domains, right? Biology is going to be the thing that determines, where the rubber meets the road, right? As long as we have the human platform, that's what it's going to be. So I take your point. But also, I think there's still a really useful component here, which is, we can still have large scale summaries, right? So, I like to try to ask the question, what matters more for your life outcomes, for, your education, your happiness, your health, right? Your nutrition, your reproductive success, even the genes you were born with or the country you were born into, right? And so in the world where the country you were born into can determine whether or not you are, subjected to warfare, right? Or in an environmental crisis, or, in a failed state, it has a huge impact. And of course, genes still matter, right? But we could do better at measuring that difference. And I think it would be interesting to do so. Yeah. As to your, other people have questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And so, Olesya and also Maurizio, right? It's Olesya, you go first.
Thank you for your talk. I have a few questions about the uses of heritability estimates in this because I'm not quite sure. What they do here, because at some point you seem to say that we see reduced heritability for certain traits, and that kind of indicates that the cultural inheritance channel is becoming more important, but we also see culture unmasking genes and increasing heritability.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if you can, use this to judge which channel is more causally important. And another question I had is that these estimates are very spatiotemporal local. They even differ across human development. They differ by context. So I'm not sure whether they can be applied to these long-term evolutionary questions that you're asking. So it would be great to hear what you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think all of your points are right. So, to what extent is a toddler influenced by, the structures of society? Not so much, right? Is it influenced? Sure, right? Yeah. How much of society has been able to program its behavior, right? Not so much. Right? So yeah, these things vary across space and time between societies, importantly, right? But there you go. Oh, between society. Well, if they vary between societies, then the between society impact can matter, right? And is part of the driver, right? So.
Yes, actually, for early development, heritability tends to be pretty low for many traits, especially cognitive traits and behavioral traits.
Right.
So that suggests that during these kind of sensitive developmental windows, environmental impacts matter a lot.
Yes.
Right? And then lately.
Oh, absolutely.
Simply because there is less variation in the environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But also the nature of, if you consider the nature of environmental variation, right? That's also useful. A lot of the times environmental variation is heavily influenced by culture, right? So for example, we might think of in development, we might think of, the care, right, nutrition, education systems you're exposed to. Well, guess what? Those have a huge impact, right? Those are actually directly the result of group level cultural adaptation systems often, right? So yes, I take your point. It does vary across the lifespan. Heritability is complex, right? And so we can't take any given piece at face value. But I will still propose that there is a long-term general pattern that extends into our deep past, and that it seems to be accelerating as well, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Fabrizio, please.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions / comments.
Ask one of them.
Yes, I have.
Yes. Happy to have conversations with everybody more later. Thank you, Libby.
To have a clear idea of what the super individual here would be, and that's to me argues against the whole point that there is a transition. We have a difficulty identifying a very basic thing, and that doesn't seem to begin with. I mean, when you're looking at other major transitions, you probably know what the super level is.
Well, because you've already done it.
Right.
Because you exist in a world where multicellular organisms.
So because it's
right.
But now if we're asking, it is happening, and we cannot really tell it's here. Well, so that argue against the point. Going by first.
Does it? So is that an argument, or is it just a?
That's I guess my question / comment was, does that
yeah.
make an argument against the proposal?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't think it's an argument against the framework. In fact, right, it's very much the idea that this is an ongoing process, right? And this is what differentiates my take from several other people, right? It's not genetic, so it's not stalled, right? It's cultural, and it's accelerating. That helps us understand some of these processes. But yeah, understanding or knowing what a cultural superorganism is, an organism thing that is descended from what we now call society, right? What is that? Yeah, we insert science fiction ideas here. That's not the point. The point is to do science on them. So I can't tell you precisely what it is. I think there are versions, and some people have published on the idea of it could be some AI human hybrid thing, right? I think that version is, well, anyway. But what does it look like? I don't think it's too much of a cost to the theory that we who haven't gone through the transition can't figure out exactly what it looks like at this point. I mean, I'm going to be doing modeling work soon on trying to make a very basic version of this process work as a start. Not going to tell me the details though.
Colleague next to Maurizio, and then Gerd have a question.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for the talk. So I'm wondering, and might be an annoying question.
Oh, please.
What do you think of Neanderthals and other hominins?
Yeah.
Do you imagine them already having a genetic basis for the same kind of cultural transition, and Homo sapiens just getting there faster, or do you imagine there are different pathways on creating the machinery that later drives the transition?
I'm not a Neanderthal scholar, but I think it's reasonable to assume that there could well be, differences in cognition between different, hominin species. That could have had impacts on how, adaptive culture accumulated. I think this needs to be better explored. But Neanderthals were pretty amazing. I don't have a strong empirically informed answer there. But yeah, I think this is an interesting question. And another way for me to expand your question is when you look at, human ancestors and other lineages that no longer exist, and indeed other primate lineages today, then that can be useful in terms of understanding sociality and cultural accumulation both, because this framework requires both, right? Requires really strong cooperation as well as cumulative cultural evolution capacities. And so I think that's, yeah, and there's lots of great work ongoing there too.
Yes, please.
We still have time.
That's,
Well,
I think, the last question.
Yeah.
Quickly, Tim, seems to me that the approach you have been outlining to us heavily rests on a gene culture dichotomy.
Sure, yes.
Very much so.
Sure.
And this in turn rests on the assumption of an underlying evolutionary theory that is heavily based on genetics, right? And I had thought we have overcome this because there are evolutionary models that explicitly include cultural inheritance, other forms of non-DNA based inheritance, human agency or organismal agency, et cetera, et cetera. And if you take that model, that is actually adopted in many fields of anthropology and even sociology and linguistics, et cetera, then you don't get this sharp distinction because it's actually part of the model already. And I think so. Our approaches to these topics depend very much on which kind of theory your underlying or you assume is underlying your argument.
Right. So I take your point and I of course agree, but I do and I want to sort of apologize for sort of maybe casting them in such a way.
Yes, you said the biologists.
I do. I mean, this is
not all biologists do.
No, not at all. This is a quick and dirty way to get people to care about the differences and to show that there's some disagreement in the literature. So I want to apologize for making that such a quick sort of quip. I really agree, right? When we look at what the determinants of behavior are, for example, right? Or the role of the environment, right? And genes, culture, and the environment, right? And so determining phenotypes. So I take your point, but I also think I want to sort of push back a bit because yes, I'm characterizing these as two sort of major and relatively separate inheritance mechanisms. And yet, I believe we can do a pretty good job of counting up pieces of adaptive culture that are very much not inherited by genes, right? Where we can get folks from all over the world and teach them the skill and they can survive in the environment better now that they have the skill, right? And that's a pretty sharp line, right? We have no genes for developing bone sunglasses that the Inuits were wearing, but they help you not go blind when you're hunting on the snow. And that's even exposure to that problem is probably the result of the fact that the populations were able to get there because they were already culturally adapted to colder environments, et cetera. So, yeah, I take your point, but at the same time, and there are many different types of inheritances. They all matter in different degrees and different times. But when I look at this pattern and when I look at the full-time depth, I see something that really feels like an RNA DNA situation. Does that mean genes go away? No, right? RNA is still here playing a useful role, right? Genes are, still here. They still play a useful role. They're not directly encoded by, culture yet, but, in the case where we made I don't remember if it's the flavor saver tomato, whatever that tomato is that's genetically modified in that particular way, where it has genes from a fish, that's cultural transmission, right? Modifying the genetic lineage, right? So, this is like the thing that happened before, where we saw this transition of, the question is, where is the, majority of adaptive information stored in which reservoir? And there will be some in all sorts of reservoirs, right? But it seems like we're going from a case where we have a lot in genes and a relatively small amount, or none, depending on how deep we go, to a situation now where we all depend on, devices that require 1 billion people to have an economy to be able to create in the first place. It's hard to overstate the scale of that shift, even today. And I don't think we're done. So I'll leave it there.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you all.
The online audience, we've copied the questions in the chat, and I'll pass them on to Tim, and then he can choose whether he wants to answer them in writing or not.
Put in your email and I'll reply.
And to the people in the room, we'll have drinks and snacks as usual in the canteen, so please don't leave. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very provoking.
Yeah.